All right, thanks, kiddo, again, and hello again. So, yeah, we're gonna just jump right in, and y'all have heard a lot about Aoudad already, and we've been doing a lot of work on this. So I'm gonna do my level best to stay within time, but no promises. You've heard a lot about them already, but just for some background, make sure everybody's on the same page. Aoudad are also called Barbary sheep. If you're in New Mexico, that's what they're called. And they are actually native to the mountains of northern Africa. So they're found in the Sahara, the mountains in the central Sahara, as well as the coastal mountains along the Barbary coast, the Atlas Mountains is where they're native. And they hold a unique distinction. They are one of very few species that are listed as threatened in their native range, but invasive globally by the same organization, which is an interesting hat to wear. From the Texas perspective, the first really documented introduction of them was into Palo Canyon in the 1950s, with the objective by the forerunner of Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to produce a supplemental game species. And that really is a management goal that they achieved. Aoudad are very much a viable supplemental game species, and they've brought West Texas national notoriety as a result. As the author of that article writes, it's an honest God sheep hunt, but it's affordable. And so that's made it a very popular hunt, and especially lately, and it's become a major regional economic driver in this ecoregion, perhaps even one of the biggest, not only for like direct hunting fees and all the associated costs that go with that, but also the use of hotels, restaurants, stores in town, things like that. And so they've become culturally emblematic of the Trans-Pecos at this point. They're ingrained. I mean, the feed store used to sell a T-shirt that had an Aoudad on it. You know, who's your Aoudad? Alpine, Texas. That's a cultural thing, right? They're on murals in Fort Davis and Alpine. They're a big part of this community, and that's great. But it did come with unintended consequences. Aoudad now occur throughout the Trans-Pecos, as Jose was showing. The density varies, but it can be extremely high, as we're going to see. The total population is still unknown. But as we've seen with this growth, our native species are really at critical lows. Desert bighorn are the lowest they've been since restoration success. And mule deer are the lowest they've ever been on record right now. A little higher now, thanks, Sean. But they weren't doing so good last year. And this really leads to concerns about habitat degradation due to Aoudad, competition between Aoudad and native species, and as you've heard already, the transmission of disease. And so we really need rigorous information to address these kinds of issues, identify what are real issues, the magnitudes of those issues, to make any real sense of this situation and find achievable management solutions. And there's a lot of questions that we have to ask. I mean, things as basic as how many are there we don't have answered, right? And then how many Aoudad are too many for our native species? They're going to have to coexist. Where can that happen? At what Aoudad abundance can that happen? How connected are these Aoudad populations? Like, what kind of scale of management are we really talking about? What do their population dynamics look like? We don't know things as basic as their survival or their population growth rates, and let alone how effective these management efforts are, and what else we need to know to figure out how to manage MOB among Aoudad, because that's really the key to managing the risk to desert bighorn. And so let's start with how many are there. As we've said, there's no accurate estimate in the Trans-Pecos, and so we started chipping away at that using some really cool survey methods, using forward-looking infrared cameras or FLIR cameras mounted in a fixed-wing aircraft, as you can see here. At the time, this was the only civilian contractor with the same grade of camera that's on like a Reaper or Predator drone. We just don't have a Vulcan cannon attached to it. So we surveyed 2 mountain ranges in the first year that we did this, and we expanded to include 3 more areas, 2 more mountain ranges, and actually a pronghorn herd unit that wasn't intended to be an Aoudad survey, but surprise. We used the same kind of distance sampling framework that Sean mentioned before that we use for pronghorn, except that this is a much more precise estimate of distances because the plane does not disturb the animals. All those pronghorn you saw were running. These Aoudad are being Aoudad. We see nursing, tending fawns or lambs, fighting. We get all kinds of cool things. So we really, really get good estimates. And so for those first 5 areas, these are the numbers. In the Chinati Mountains, we were close to 8,000 animals in 2024, an Aoudad to 40 acres essentially. The Quitman Mountains was 2,600. The Davis Mountains, not even the full range, just the central core part of it was almost 4,000, 3,836. Glass Mountains were 2,400, and There's even 250 of them out there in pronghorn habitat. And so the colored areas right there total 7.14% of the Trans-Pecos, and we estimate that there were 17,015 animals in that 7% of the region. If you were to extend that out to the entire area, that's 224,000 aoudad in the Trans-Pecos. That number's not on this slide for a reason, though. We sampled areas we knew there were aoudad because we were trying to figure these methods out, herd unit 38 notwithstanding. So these are biased high, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's half that. So I would say that a safe bet is over 100,000, which means that there's a lot of aoudad. And so when you have a lot of aoudad, you have to start thinking about how we manage competition. And this is where really the first study came in to look at that. This was in 2019, well, actually 2018 is when it started, through 2021 in the Van Horn Mountains. We called it the BAM project. It's now BAM 1.0. But that stands for Bighorn, Aoudad, Mule Deer. And that was the first look we had at how these three species interacted. And what we saw was really interesting. These dots, and some of y'all are going to laugh at me because this is routine now. These dots are all individual animals. And where that animal is on that plot, where it is in that space, is describing how it's using that habitat. And so this is really a view of these populations' niches, the way that they can use resources successfully. And there's a lot of stuff here that's not very surprising, like the mule deer niche, the green dots, they're really spread out. They have a large niche. Well, that's like a generalist species. There's a lot of different ways they can use the environment. They're actually behind the blue and red dots, so they're not overlapping very much with the aoudad or the bighorn. The blue dots are the bighorn, and they're all balled up there. There's a very narrow range of ways bighorn can successfully use habitats. They're a specialist, and we see that here. But what we didn't expect to see was what was going on with those aoudad, the red dots. They're all balled up there, overlapping the bighorn. They're acting like a specialist for the same habitats the bighorn were. And that's really important here because this is really likely driven by aoudad density. Before this project started, the ranch was actively aerially gunning aoudad. And so we're actually looking at what a small, relatively small aoudad population does when they interact with bighorn and mule deer. So that has an important consequence. That means that competition, the less those niches overlap, the less likely those animals are to compete. That means competition with mule deer is probably manageable. Bighorn, it's tougher, but the book's not closed yet. And so that's where this BAM 2.0 study that Jose was talking about, it's got an identity crisis. They call it MAM, we call it BAM. There's a lot to that. But we expanded on that research and we started working the Chinades and Quitman Mountains that I talked about before. We did the initial captures in March of 2023. We recaptured and recollared the same animals with some replacements in 2025. But we had 40 aoudad and 40 mule deer in both mountain ranges, or in each of the mountain ranges, and we had an even split with the sexes, and we were collaring all of them. And we've been following those for 3 years. We've got one more year at least to go, depending on how the batteries hold up. But the important part of the study is we wanted to see the effect of management. And so we partnered with private landowners and the Chinade State Natural Area to aerially gun 3/4 of the aoudad population out of those areas of the Chinade Mountains in the second year of the study. And then we observed what happened afterwards to look for signatures of competition. Now, the results of that are pending, but we're learning a lot as we go. And the other questions that we were trying to answer along the way, we're already starting to pick up. So how connected are these populations? Well, you can start looking at that in terms of their range sizes. And what we see is that aoudad ranges are huge. The median annual range size for an aoudad ram is 19,237 acres. That's 4 times what a mule deer buck's is. The ewes are using 5,000 acres a year compared to only 766 for a mule deer doe. And that's just kind of the middle, right? That's the median. Those distributions are really, really skewed. And as you can see, they're really variable. And what's normal, the upper end of normal, is around 50,000 acres. And if we look at our aoudad population, there's 8 aoudad that were collared that have used more than 50,000 acres per year. And it's extremely more. It was 7 rams and a ewe, so ewes make big movements too. And with replacements and collar failures, that actually amounts to about 7.9% of the population that is responsible for these really long-range movements. The maximum range size we've observed was just barely shy of 500,000 acres in a year. And that was the pink guy, that's actually a ram, that was moving between the Quitman Mountains all the way down to just almost in the Sierra Viejas. He crossed 4 mountain ranges. And he didn't stop anywhere. He was moving all throughout those the entire time. and he was actively infected with MOV while he did it. What this really shows is that all of these mountain ranges are really connected. And one other really important point here. Of these really long-ranging animals, 3, possibly 4, were trophy rams that were harvested by hunters, and we actually got failed callers back to learn this. So trophy hunting probably is helping some of these super spreaders get them off the landscape. But what this really means is that all of these mountain ranges, starting from the Quitmans all the way down to the Chinattis, all of the ranges along the Rio Grande corridor there are effectively an Aoudad metapopulation. And that looks really clear when we add in the Van Horn data from before, and we see that they were moving all throughout them. What's interesting is that there's very little connectivity with Mexico. They've gone right to the river, but only one of them is crossed, and he didn't stay over there very long. We're also learning about the population dynamics as we go on this study, and that shows up in their survival curves. We've got quite a bit of data now on this, and Aoudad's annual survival is averaging right at 95%, just a hair shy. And our mule deer are not doing anywhere near as well. So our mule deer have to make at least a 25% fawn crop to hold steady in these circumstances, and they're not doing that. This also allows us to infer what the life expectancy of these animals are under these conditions. And the Aoudad life expectancy is projected of an adult Aoudad. We don't have any lamb information, but the adult Aoudad you can expect to live 16 years. That's the median lifespan. Our mule deer, on the other hand, they've got 2.7. We were really surprised by that. And despite better rains in 2025, it does seem like the mortality rate accelerated in both mountain range. And so what about the Aoudad management part of this? Well, we implemented aerial gunning in the Chinatti Mountains only on those cooperating properties. And we began July 29th, and per landowner request, we got it all done before October. And we flew 90 and a quarter hours. It's 90 hours and 17 minutes. And we removed 5,773 confirmed down Aoudad in that time. Total cost was just slightly over $250,000. We were averaging 321 Aoudad a day. We were shooting an Aoudad a minute for 90 hours and 17 minutes. And we wanted to see what the impact might be. We get asked a lot about, how much forage did that save, or how did y'all pick up the carcasses? And we did some projections to kind of look at that. And if we had removed all of those, we would have actually removed over 721,000 pounds of organic material out of that mountain system if we had removed those carcasses, which is substantial. And using NRCS's figures for their animal unit equivalents for Aoudad, we actually would have saved 19.7 million pounds of forage over the following year, and that's equivalent to 2,078 mama cows with a calf, 1,000-pound cows with a calf. That's a lot of forage. But when you look at it a little long-term and what that did at a population level, on the left-hand side, you have our first year's survey data. The left graph is the Aoudad, the red is in the Chinattis, the blue is in the Quitmans. And you can see where we started, 7861, and we made a dent. But 3,624 is substantially higher than what our previous estimate minus our take would have been. And that gives us a look at what their population growth rate would be. And we estimated that at 16% annually, and that works like compound interest. It's a 16% interest rate is what they grow at. And we projected that would lead to a 5.5-ish year recovery time to pre-treatment population sizes in that mountain range. And so we actually hit them again and took another 1,495 the following year. And we thought that would extend their recovery time to approximately 8 years. And that is absolutely not what happened. They're almost all the way back already. We got more rain in 2025, and that population in the Chinattis rebounded hard. We're about 70% of where we started after just 2 years. They will be back to pre-treatment levels by next year. What we also see, though, is that we had a response in our mule deer. We took some competitive pressure off. We got some rain, and it looks like they made use of it. It looks like our fawn crop kind of got them back to where they started before. They had declined really sharply the previous year. They hadn't had a growing season to feel the benefit of the management in the second year, so they did drop off. In the Quitmans, there was actually some helicopter gunning that the landowners initiated in the second year, and it was a few hundred animals. And we actually augmented that just a little bit, but it didn't change anything. The population actually grew. and the mule deer population has been in steady decline over there without any serious management intervention. And we projected out what kind of lamb recruitment that would take to produce the jump we saw between 2025 and 2026. And we were using our survival data, and Aoudad sex ratios at a herd level are actually very consistent across populations in the literature. Using the range of variation that we saw, that really only requires an Aoudad ewe to raise 1 or 1.2, somewhere in their lambs per year. And they routinely twin and they can breed twice a year. So that's really not a tall order for an Aoudad ewe. Certainly there was some inward migration that probably contributed to this. I'm sure, the southern Sierra Vieja are certainly connected, but the rate that happens is pretty low based on our collar data. And so it's entirely plausible that rebound was by reproduction alone. And this just highlights that ewe management in Aoudad is really critical. If you need to regulate that population, you have to hit those ewes aggressively. We've also gotten some insights for managing MOV among Aoudad. These FLIR surveys in particular give really excellent data on Aoudad group sizes because we're not disturbing them. We get a really good picture of what that herd structure looks like. And this is a statistical thing, and we're not going to have a stats lesson necessarily, but Aoudad group sizes follow an interesting statistical distribution, and that's this red one down here. It's a power law distribution, and it has a fat right tail. That just means that big groups are much more common than we would normally think they would be with how populations tend to distribute themselves. It's an unusual distribution for a wildlife biologist to use. And that's important mathematically because it actually implies that they exhibit super spreader dynamics. Essentially, the behavior of Aoudad as the host overcomes any transmission inhibition by the pathogen. They're little pressure cookers of MOV infection. But that's actually not a bad thing in this case because it gives us a clear management direction. If you can truncate that tail, if you can basically knock off the biggest groups, you have a disproportionate impact on the transmission rate of MOV. And so whereas COVID was all flat in the curve, for Aoudad, it's really cut off the tail. We want to target the biggest groups in those aerial gunning efforts to achieve an epidemiological benefit. Even if you're not removing all of your Aoudad, plenty of people don't, you can manage the epidemiology. And there's actually a little bit more to that beyond just what the FLIR survey showed us. A collar data are showing us this too. There was an interesting behavioral response to gunning. We were concerned that we would actually cause dispersal, like make Aoudad leave the mountain range in response to gunning, or even make the mule deer do it, even though they weren't the target species. And that was not what happened at all. They actually hunkered down. The really interesting thing is that the social behavior changed. So we can track how associated those animals are through time with the GPS collars. And what we saw is that the Aoudad population fragmented into smaller groups, probably to avoid being detected by a helicopter. But the mule deer actually aggregated. They kind of balled up into larger groups, and so they had much higher contact rates. And that's a documented thing in the western states, that mule deer share the burden of being vigilant with predators, so they form bigger groups. And that's actually kind of important because some of the mountain ranges who are interested in managing Aoudad in are CWD positive. Aerial gunning may accelerate CWD transmission under those circumstances. And so you need to be cautious in how that's applied. Sorry, Jose. And Sean. But it's really pretty interesting how that works, and trapping is certainly worth considering under those conditions. But summing all this up, Aoudad really likely are the most numerous big game animal in the Trans-Pecos at this point. They're long-lived and they're clearly capable of rapid population growth, and that means they're not going away. Eliminating Aoudad from the landscape, that's a pipe dream. That's not going to happen. And there's plenty of good reasons that people don't want that to happen. But that doesn't mean you can't manage them. And should, but that management's going to have to happen considering a big scale. Mountain ranges, completely disjunct mountain ranges, are influenced by each other because these populations are acting as that metapopulation. There's transmission of disease and there's transmission of individuals between them, and so that's got to be considered. Fortunately, Aoudad competition with mule deer does appear to be manageable. The evidence collectively shows it is, but that is a very serious and sustained and expensive effort. But for any Aoudad management program, ewe harvest really needs to be considered because we've got limited resources and we're in a drought-prone area, and they're really resilient to that with very few natural predators. One of the things I didn't mention is that we've only had now 3 natural mortalities among these Aoudad. One fell off a cliff, one actually did succumb to an MOV, and we last week had one die from the pink eye infection in the Chinati Mountains. Other than that, all of the mortalities are either bullets or suspected bullets, and one fence, which we ruled an accident. So ewe harvest is really something that all managers should be considering in how they manage their forage and their habitat. The behavioral response to aerial gunning on 2 different fronts appears to be beneficial for disease management. So even if you're not removing all the aoudad, managing that conscientiously can help bighorn restoration even in other mountain ranges. And again, aerial gunning should be considered cautiously in areas with CWD. We're still working on it. We haven't answered the how many or too many just yet. We haven't answered how do MOV outbreaks spread amongst aoudad, but we've got a student somewhere in here, there she is, that's actually working on that question. We're also curious how long it takes rams to mature into trophies, and so what's that regeneration time of your stock, basically, from that management aspect. And then what does lamb survival and recruitment look like? We're interested in testing out our projection. I know that's a lot, and I really appreciate y'all hanging on through that right before lunch, but I'm happy to take any questions.
The question I have is, what's contributed to their decline in North Africa?
So in North Africa, they're kind of the last man standing. So the ungulate community in North Africa used to consist of scimitar, horned oryx, Arabian oryx, dama gazelle, addax, and aoudad. And of those, aoudad are the only one that are not threatened or endangered or extinct. They're just threatened. And that has to do mostly with their habitat preferences and that they're really tough to chew. So there's some human resource selection for the other ungulates that happen first, but they're really struggling with subsistence hunting and poaching in pre-conflict corn areas of North Africa.
Hey, so in BAM 1.0, you talked about that they really were selecting for, that a niche, right? Which overlapped with the bighorn. But then in BAM 2.0 and in those dispersals, we're looking at this movement between mountain ranges, metapopulation. And so it suggests to me that they're able to feed themselves as they're moving across those ranges. And with anecdotal, evidence of them grazing out in pastures and things alongside the cattle, how comfortable are you with that initial BAM 1.0? I guess you get where I'm trying to go here. Are they generalists or are they
the initial interpretation? Yeah,
right.
No, I'm still pretty comfortable with it. And the reason is that we're not saying that they're always one thing. The niche can change. And I think that we're seeing evidence of that. One of the reasons that we chose the Chinades was because we believed it to be the highest density of aoudad that we had, anecdotally. And so what we were actually trying to capture is at that higher density, does the niche expand and do they overlap with mule deer more? We haven't answered that question yet, which is why I didn't really dig into it, but that's actually the whole motivator behind that study is, does the niche change with abundance? And if it does, that could actually drive exactly the pattern you're talking about, because it makes sense, right? If you're going to basically graze it to the dirt, you have to keep moving to find new forage, and that would explain these large range sizes. And I'm happy to take questions over the break too.